It's 4:17 in the morning on July 6th, and the Gazprom Neft refinery in Omsk is doing exactly what it has done every night for half a century, swallowing 22 million tons of crude oil a year and turning out the gasoline that keeps half of Siberia running. It's the biggest refinery in all of Russia. It's also 2,500 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian soldier, and that's exactly why, on this particular night, the entire watch consisted of 4 men and 1 radar screen. From 2,500 kilometers away, this war is something you catch on the news. Nobody in Omsk had ever actually heard an air raid siren go off. Distance was their only real defense. But that night, something had already been in the air heading their way for almost 18 hours. The day before, a handful of small, slow shapes had lifted off from a field somewhere between Poltava and Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine and turned east, flying low, hour after hour, over forests, over farmland, over half a sleeping Russia. Their target had been loaded into their onboard computers before they ever left the ground, the exact coordinates of the distillation towers at Omsk. Nothing stopped them for nearly the whole trip, because the trouble with defending the largest country on the planet, stretched across 11 time zones, is that you can't post a pantsir behind every tree. Russia keeps its systems where the war is actually happening, at the front, around Moscow, around St. Petersburg. Siberia had to defend itself with nothing but distance. The only real barrier sat halfway along the route, in the Urals, the invisible seam between European Russia and Siberia. That's where the serious radar lived, where batteries were genuinely on watch. And there, near Kazan, a pantsir operator picked up the returns entering his sector. Weak, low, flickering in and out, like moths circling a streetlight. His first guess was a software glitch. His second was a flock of geese. He never reached a third guess because one of the returns changed direction, a degree left, half a degree right, with a precision no goose has ever managed in the history of evolution. And it happened one at a time, as if each moth had its own pilot inside, and all of them had decided in the same instant to head for the same streetlight. The order to fire went out. The Pantsir S-1 locked onto the one echo it could hold steady, the closest, the highest, the one that briefly stopped flickering, and launched a 57 E6, 3 million rubles streaking across the sky to bring down $55,000 worth of plywood. It got lucky. The target broke apart in a short orange flash. Nothing inside it was expensive enough to mourn. The rest never even flinched. One by one, they adjusted course, left Russia's last serious battery behind, and kept flying east into empty sky where no radar was even looking for them. The operator did exactly what protocol required. He sounded the alarm. By that hour, Russian Air Command already knew an unidentified swarm had crossed the Urals, pointed at Siberia. They had 10 hours to respond. Somewhere in Moscow, someone looked at the track, measured the distance to the nearest target worth defending, and filed it away, because those drones had 10 hours of flight remaining, and by every Russian calculation, no more than 5 hours of fuel left in the tank, which meant, on paper, Omsk was safe, and technically, they weren't wrong. The duty officer hadn't filed the alert out of laziness. He filed it because he'd run the numbers correctly. His screen showed the Kazan track, heading east, 160 kilometers an hour, low altitude, and he had the spec sheet for the exact model the Pantsir had just turned into a fireball, because Russia has spent 2 years collecting pieces of these things scattered across half the country. It's called the FP-1, built by Firepoint, a company out of Kyiv, founded in 2022 by a group of friends, engineers, architects, and video game designers who started building weapons in improvised workshops. 3.5 meters long, 5-meter wingspan, a 2-cylinder engine turning a propeller, a warhead somewhere between 70 and 120 kilograms, and a fuselage made of plywood, the same wood you'd find in cheap furniture. $55,000 a unit, 100 of them a day, and the number that mattered that night. Maximum range, 1,600 kilometers. Do the arithmetic. The straight-line distance from the Ukrainian border to Omsk is 2,500 kilometers. On the evasive path the swarm was actually flying, it came out closer to 3,000. The swarm was 900 kilometers short of fuel for reaching anything worth protecting. The officer didn't need interceptors, he needed patience. Those drones were going to run dry and fall on their own somewhere over the steppe, and the problem would take care of itself through gravity. Spec sheets describe a weapon the way it was built, not necessarily the way it flies today. Every 40 minutes he got another yellow alert, potential threat. Sector such and such, unidentified, east of the Urals. Russian radar coverage is riddled with gaps, so the largest country on Earth was watching its own sky like a smoke detector that can only tell you there's a fire somewhere in the house, without saying where. Yellow alert after yellow alert, correct 5 times running. That's a hard streak for a mistake to beat. Overhead, the FP-1 was flying on inertial navigation, correcting course through satellite fixes using SREPA antennas that Firepoint builds in-house, specifically to keep the drone from chasing a spoofed coordinate. Flying by inertia is a bit like crossing your own house in the dark by counting your footsteps. It works, right up until somebody moves a chair. Here's what the officer's spec sheet couldn't tell him, and what everyone missed. Look at the wing. It's no longer the narrow, straight wing off the FP-1 that Russia had been picking out of wreckage for 2 years. This one is trapezoidal, a straight leading edge tapering toward the tip. Less drag, better lift distribution. But that wasn't done for aerodynamics. It was done because the wing is now the fuel tank. Firepoint turned the surface, holding the plane up into the surface, feeding it fuel. The way a camel's hump works. The reserve isn't tucked inside the animal. The reserve is part of the animal's shape. According to chief designer Dennis Stillerman, this wing pushes the FP-1's range out to 3,400 kilometers. Analysts who first spotted it in satellite imagery gave it a designation the company itself never used. The FP-1ER, extended range, 900 extra kilometers of flight, hidden inside a wing, appearing from nowhere. And even with that, most of them still weren't going to make it. Out of the roughly 100 units Firepoint sends out daily, about 10% reach their target. That sounds like a failure rate, but it's actually a business model. When each unit costs less than a mid-range sedan, you don't need every single one to arrive. You just need enough of them to get through. Video game designers understood that on day one. It takes militaries decades to catch up to the same idea. If the unit is cheap enough, losing most of them is acceptable. Then, finally, an alert came through with something none of the earlier ones had: an actual location. Moscow went looking for a battery to redirect to Omsk and discovered what had been true for 10 hours already. There wasn't one. The only asset in the entire arsenal that could cover that distance in the time left didn't roll on wheels. It flew. What Russia scrambled into the Siberian sky that morning was, quite literally, the best it had, not as a figure of speech. First, an A-50U, a flying radar station, the aircraft that tells the rest of the Air Force where to look. Russia has so few of these left that every launch is a gamble. And right behind it, something almost unthinkable, a Su-57, the 5th-generation stealth fighter, the crown jewel of the fleet, of which there may be 9 operational airframes, maybe 30. Moscow won't say, and there's a reason for that silence. armed with R-73 missiles on external pylons and a 101 KSN electro-optical targeting pod slung under the nose. In 3.5 years of war, nobody had ever seen those two aircraft operating together over the same patch of ground. Russia had been saving its two best assets for a special occasion, and that occasion turned out to be some wooden drones. In theory, this should have been simple for Russia. The A-50U spots them. The Su-57 closes the distance at 9 times their speed. And 20 minutes later, the whole problem is a pile of smoking splinters scattered across the steppe. But the A-50U's screen showed nothing. Here's what was actually happening. A Doppler radar doesn't detect objects. It detects motion relative to itself. That's the only way it can function over land. Because if it displayed everything that bounced back a signal, the screen would be a solid white wall of forests, hills, and rooftops. So it filters out anything moving below a certain relative speed, tags it as ground clutter, and erases it. It's the T-Rex from Jurassic Park. Stay still and it can't see you. The FP-1 was crawling along at 160 kilometers an hour, hugging the terrain. Slow enough that Russia's best radar looked directly at it and decided it was simply part of the landscape. So the Su-57 had to do what pilots did back in 1943, drop low and look out the window. The electro-optical pod swept the ground, hunting for a 3.5-meter shape somewhere across an endless stretch of Siberian forest. And once it finally spotted one, the pilot ran headfirst into the second problem, and this one has no fix. A Su-57 physically cannot fly at 160 kilometers an hour. It isn't a matter of choice. Below that speed, the wings simply stop generating lift, and it stops being an aircraft and becomes $40 million falling out of the sky. It can't pull up alongside the drone and take a leisurely shot. It has to scream past at full speed and squeeze everything out of a fleeting window. Do the math along with him. Closing head-on, the combined speed comes out to roughly 240 meters per second. The R-73 needs about 300 meters of travel before it arms. That leaves a firing window of roughly 1,200 meters, about 5 seconds, to identify, aim, lock, and fire. Miss it, and turning back around eats over 2 minutes, because a 20-ton fighter jet at that speed turns like an oil tanker. 2 minutes is exactly enough time for the rest of the swarm to advance another 5 kilometers and scatter into the tree line. 4 seconds in, and then the third problem, the worst one of all. The R-73 is a heat seeker. The FP-1 runs on a 2-cylinder engine, basically an oversized lawnmower motor that barely climbs 40 degrees above ambient temperature. And this was the afternoon of July 6th over western Siberia, ground baking after a full day of sun. Russia's deadliest short-range missile was searching for the flame of a cigarette lighter on the hood of a car parked in direct sunlight. 3 seconds, it caught something. A single, clean heat signature, briefly separated from the background. 2, 1. The R-73 dropped off the pylon. The FP-1 didn't maneuver, didn't dispense flares, didn't do anything at all, because it had nothing on board to respond with. The proximity fuse did its job, and 3.5 meters of Ukrainian plywood turned into splinters over the Russian forest. Russia's most advanced stealth fighter was sweeping the tree line with a camera, hunting for flying furniture, while an irreplaceable radar plane circled overhead, showing nothing on its screen at all. Russia sent its invisible aircraft after something it couldn't even see, and it never caught a second one. Not one other battery fired. Not one siren sounded in time. All 10 hours of warning Russia had were completely wasted, because for 9 of those hours, everyone kept doing the wrong math correctly. Finally, At 12:04 in the afternoon, the surviving FP-1s arrived over Russia's largest refinery and found precisely the defense they'd been promised: none. And they flew straight past the storage tanks. This is the part that matters. A crude oil tank looks like the obvious target. It's enormous, it's round, it burns spectacularly, and it makes for great footage. But the FP-1s ignored it entirely. They went straight for a cluster of narrow steel towers in the center of the plant. The AVT-11, the largest primary distillation unit at Omsk, producing 8.5 million tons a year. A storage tank is just a pantry, and a pantry can always be restocked. The distillation column is the kitchen, and it doesn't matter how much food is sitting in the pantry if the kitchen is gone. The first FP-1 dipped its nose, lined its 3.5 meters of plywood up with the base of the column, and stopped adjusting course. After 18 hours, 3,000 kilometers, and an entire war fought in arithmetic, there was nothing left to calculate. 2 seconds. 1. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then 3.5 meters of plywood met a steel tower, and wood did exactly what wood does. It disintegrated. 60 kilos of explosives tore open the column wall. A single hole was all it took, because inside a primary distillation unit, crude oil isn't sitting there quietly. It's boiling at 350 degrees, well past the point where nearly everything in it ignites on its own. Nobody needed to set fire to Russia's largest refinery. They just needed to open it up. Picture a pan of oil that's been left on a hot burner for half an hour. You don't need a match, just one careless moment. Omsk came with its own ignition source built in. The rest of the drones went for the pipe walkways, the elevated metal bridges that carry fire from one processing unit to the next, and that's exactly what happened. The fire jumped and took out the AVT-10, the sister unit right next door. That night, NASA satellites picked up the heat signatures from orbit. Days later, Maxar imagery confirmed 4 separate impacts. Run the final numbers. The AVT-11 accounted for 37% of the plant's capacity. The AVT-10 accounted for another 38%. 75% gone. 22 million tons a year, 1 out of every 10 barrels Russia refines, shut down, with repairs expected to take at least half a year. And then came the part that hurts the most, because Omsk is the only refinery in the entire country that produces cracking catalysts, the ingredient every other refinery in Russia needs just to keep operating. It's the only yeast plant in the whole country, and every bakery depends on it. Under sanctions, buying replacement catalysts abroad simply isn't an option. That day, it wasn't just one refinery that went dark. A piece of every other refinery in Russia went dark with it. For 3.5 years, geography protected Russia better than its army ever did. That was always the arrangement. The largest country on Earth had so much depth that the war never touched the bottom of it. But on July 6, 2026, a plywood aircraft with a wing full of gasoline flew for 18 hours and rewrote that arrangement. So if Ukraine can reach Omsk, it can reach anywhere. That's it for today.